The Kind-Hearted Monster, two classic stories by Max Veltheige. Max Veltheige's The Kind-Hearted Monster, two classic stories. Once, long ago, in a country that was halfway to nowhere, there was a peaceful little town where people lived contentedly. They did their work and minded their own business, and there was nothing much to upset them. Until one day a farmer came running to his neighbors in a fearful state. "Somebody stole my corn," he shouted. "Stole your corn?" his neighbors said. "We'll soon see about that." And off they went in fine fettle, determined to catch the thief. But there wasn't a soul in sight. However, the next morning they all got up early, even before the sun rose, and suddenly at the edge of the cornfield they saw a great flash of flame. As any sensible people would, they sent for the fire brigade, which came at once with clanging bells and a siren screaming. As they were faced with the fearsome sight, a monster breathing flames with every breath. But by pumping and squirting and spraying, they managed at last to put out the flames. And there stood the monster at the edge of the wood, staring sadly at the firemen and the farmers, who stared back at him. "Arrest that monster!" barked the sergeant. And although the monster turned tail and ran, he was exhausted by all the water that had been squirted at him, and he was caught without much of a struggle. Then, looking rather downcast, the monster was led into a town under heavy guard. The folk came rushing to see the sight, and even the mayor came out of his parlor to thank the firemen for their morning's work. Of course, there was a lot of discussion as to what could be done with this unusual prisoner. "Put him in jail," someone said. "Attack him," said another. "Please," said the monster, "my name's Mervyn, and I don't want to be attacked." Then an important general decided that a flame-throwing monster could be taught to be a soldier, and the very next day the training began. Mervyn was led into a field to face a target. "Now," roared the general, "take aim, fire!" But Mervyn closed his eyes, waved his tail, and ate. "Oh, brother," said the general. "Now, once again, ready, steady, fire!" But Mervyn only sighed and munched another clump of grass. "Please," he said, "I'm a mild sort of monster, and I don't really want to be a soldier." No matter how much the general shouted, he got nowhere at all and gave up in disgust. "Well," said the mayor, "our monster clearly isn't dangerous, so how about making some money using him? We'll put him in a cage and people can pay to see him." And that's what they did. They built a strong cage and popped Mervyn inside. But Mervyn hated being caged, and with one great heave of his tail, he uprooted the iron bars and started to walk away, cage and all. "Please," said Mervyn as he trotted off, "I'm a shy sort of monster, and I don't really like being stared at." By this time, the mayor was getting a bit desperate, and he asked the advice of the professor with brains, no hair, and glasses, who sat up all night making plans and doing drawings. "I've invented a power station," he said. "Our monster can make fire with his flames and produce electricity. I'll light lamps and warm up water and heat cookers and be very useful." And that's what happened. Of course, there had to be a lot of digging and shoveling and begging and building, and there was a lot of running about and men shouting and so on. But at last the power station was finished, and it was a proud day for the professor. Mervyn started to work one Monday morning. He breathed flames into a funnel until the electricity got going. And he said he quite liked the idea. So, of course, all the houses were lighted up, and people had hot baths for themselves and their babies. All the moms had electric stoves to cook on and electric fires to warm their toes. Then, strangely enough, everyone who wanted to jail the monster or attack him suddenly changed their minds and wanted instead to look after him. And look after him they did. My word. They cooked dinners for Mervyn and baked him cakes and couldn't do enough for him. The mayor even invited him into his parlor and presented him with a medal, which moved Merlin so much that he shed a monstrous tear. Oh. So now Mervyn has a regular job in that little town halfway to nowhere. Every day he trots down to the river to cool off, and he often says what a blessing it is he was born a mild sort of monster, or goodness knows what might have happened. And now he thinks humans aren't so bad after all. The Monster and the Robbers by Max Velitish. In a country that was halfway to nowhere, in the mountains miles from anywhere, stood an old castle. In the castle lived a band of robbers who spent their time robbing and stealing, and they did very well because of it too. One day the leader of the robbers heard that in the town in the valley below there lived an extraordinary monster that breathed enough fire to make electricity for the whole town. So the leader called a meeting to tell the rest of the robbers all about Mervyn the monster. And, he said, this monster is very valuable, and I think we should kidnap him. But what will we do with him? Asked the robbers. If he's so big and strong, he might eat us, the leader smiled. Oh, he said, we won't keep him. We'll sell him and get a lot of money. People would pay anything to get a hold of a monster like this. And so they all settled down to decide how they would capture Mervyn the monster. At last, it was the cook who had an idea. I'll bake some cakes. All monsters love cakes, but these will be special because I'll put some sleeping powder in them. When the monster eats them, he'll fall asleep, and then we can load him onto the truck easily. The cook baked the cakes, which were delicious, and as all good cooks do, he tasted one and immediately fell asleep for 3 days. The rest of the robbers left him sleeping. They climbed into the truck and drove off to catch the monster. After a long journey, they found Mervyn, who was pleased and flattered to have visitors, not knowing a robber when he saw one. He was even more pleased to be fed a basket full of lovely cakes that, before he knew it, had made him so sleepy that he yawned and laid down. The robbers lost no time. Quickly they gathered around to tie him up, but Mervyn wasn't fully asleep yet, and he frightened the robbers half to death when he wriggled and shook himself so that they fell every which way. Then, at long last, the sleeping powder worked, and Mervyn fell to the ground in a deep sleep and began to snore monstrous snores. Now's our chance, said the leader. And they took heavy ropes and wrapped them around and round poor Mervyn until at last he was hauled onto the back of the truck, all tied up. By now it was nighttime, but the moon shone down to light the robbers on their way. They drove off, pleased with themselves. When they reached the castle, it was dawn and Mervyn's getting up time. At first he lay still, wondering what happened, and then he remembered and felt the ropes that were binding him. Said Mervyn, I may be a bit slow, but I'm not putting up with this. And he rolled over to stand on his feet. The truck went over too. The ropes broke and the robbers fell everywhere, but Mervyn didn't look right or left. He skedaddled straight for the castle gate. In the meantime, back in the town, everyone was missing Mervyn, except the police officer, who was busy using his eyes. Our Mervyn's run away, everyone in town said unhappily. I don't think so, said the police chief. I can see clear tire tracks where a heavily loaded truck has driven away. It can't be Mervyn since he can't drive, and anyway, he doesn't have a driver's license. I think that he's been stolen. Stolen? Everybody said. It must be the robbers from the mountains. So the police chief followed the tracks, the people followed the police chief, the fire brigade followed the people, and the whole bunch of them started off for the mountains. Inside the castle, not being able to get through the heavy gates, Mervyn was putting up a good fight, breathing fire and smoke and chasing robbers everywhere. Flames were coming out of the windows and doors, and the robbers were in a panic. Giving up, the robbers ran for it and bumped straight into the police, the fire brigade, and the people, and the whole band of robbers were arrested. All except for the leader, who ran down the mountain with Mervyn chasing after him. And, of course, Mervyn caught him. Well, that's that, said the chief of police, and a good job, too. When the fire brigade had put out the fire, everyone looked around the castle, and they found hundreds of stolen things, from gold and silver to TV sets, watches, and bicycles. That's a fine day's work, said the police chief, and it's all thanks to Mervyn. And to me, of course. All the stolen goods were loaded onto the truck, and the robbers were tied onto Mervyn as they made their way back to the town. In town, there was great rejoicing. Mervyn was presented with a medal, and the band played and everyone cheered. And the little town in the little country, halfway to nowhere, lived happily ever after. Mervyn felt a bit bashful having his picture in the newspaper with lots of large letters floating around his name, but he was happy to know that people out in the world accepted and appreciated him.